Welcome to this re-recording of Session 4 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started the series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 4th of January. Today we'll be looking at Genesis 12 to 15 and Psalm 4. But so far in Genesis, we have covered the creation and the fall of humanity. God created the earth by bringing order to it and then put humans on the earth to spread that order. Instead, the humans chose to do things their own way, leading to violence, death, and the pollution of all that God had created. So God decided to wipe everything out as easy as he had first made it. Just as he split the waters to create life, he allowed the waters to rush back in and wash away all of humanity and its wickedness. He chose Noah and his family to carry on his purpose and order, as humanity was always meant to. However, we saw that Noah and his family were just as vulnerable to that same corruption. As God described it, the intentions of man's heart is evil from his youth. That's Genesis 8 verses 21. Before long, humanity was just as corrupt and wicked as before. But God had promised not to wipe out humanity again, so this time he chose to disinherit them instead. He would no longer be their God. Instead, he would put other spiritual beings in charge of them. He would then choose a new people to be his. So let's jump into today's reading, Genesis 12 to 15. We see God choose Abraham, soon to be Abraham, to be a new nation. And it is this nation that God will be God to. As we eventually will read in Deuteronomy 32, while God divided up the people into nations that his spiritual beings would lead on his behalf, the people of Israel, Abraham's descendants, would be his people, the nation that he looked after. Now you may still be thinking, but that's unfair. What about all the other nations? But let's look at the promise that God makes to Abraham. In you, all families of the world will be blessed. That's Genesis 12 verse 3. It's not 100% clear yet, but here we see the beginnings of God's plan to use Abraham's descendants, the Israelites, to be an example to the other nations, to guide them back into a personal relationship with him. God leads Abraham to the land of Canaan and promises this land to his descendants. And so the rest of Genesis is watching Abraham grow into a family, and then that family grow into a nation. What we learn immediately about Abraham is that he is a flawed human being. Despite God promising to bless him, Abraham quickly becomes afraid of the growing famine and leaves the land of Canaan and tries to save himself by going to Egypt. Like Adam and Eve, he chooses his own wisdom rather than trusting in God's wisdom. He lies about his wife being his sister and trades her off to Pharaoh for a load of cattle. He then takes both the cattle and his wife back later when Pharaoh wants nothing to do with him. Just like Eve in the Garden of Eden, the Egyptians saw that Sarah was beautiful and took her. Compare Genesis 3 verse 6 to Genesis 12 verse 15. Abraham is literally playing the role of the serpent with his deception here. Even those God chooses to be his can at times play the roles of children of the serpent. However, God is committed to Abraham despite his flaws and uses Pharaoh to bless Abraham. But because this blessing came out of Abraham's disobedience, it comes with a consequence. Abraham's newfound wealth causes division between his people and his nephew Lot, who is travelling with them. The two decide to go their separate ways, which will bring its own problems. The land that Lot chooses was at war, and Lot and his family are soon taken captive as prisoners of that war. Lot had greedily picked the best land that he could see, and now his greed has come back to get him. In contrast, Abraham selflessly goes into battle to rescue Lot, and God continues to bless him, giving him victory. This time, Abraham makes sure to honour God by giving 1/10 of his winnings to a priest of God named Melchizedek. God later confirms that he's going to give Abraham many descendants, and even though Abraham doesn't understand how, the Bible simply says he believes the Lord. That's Genesis 15 verse 6. This is why the New Testament writers applaud Abraham as our example for faith. We may not understand what God is doing or how he's going to keep his promises to us, but we can still trust and believe in him. God seals this with another covenant, a legally binding contract. This one he seals by walking through a number of cut up animal corpses. And this might seem weird to us, but this was the ancient equivalent of spitting and then shaking on something. The idea was that if the one who walks through the corpses breaks his contract, may he end up cut open like they were. Again, the God of heaven and earth makes a contract with a human where he commits himself to them no matter what they do. God then warns Abraham that his descendants will be foreigners in a different land, mistreated and enslaved for 400 years. But God will use this to bring them out of that land wealthy, so that they may return to this land and establish themselves in it. But that is Genesis 12 to 15. Now let's look at Psalm 4. This psalm is attributed to King David and can be labelled a lament psalm, which makes up 1/3 of all psalms. Biblical lament is whenever a person takes their pains, hurts and frustrations before God. Includes 4 steps: turning to God, bringing a complaint before God, making a request of God, and then declaring trust in God. Here's a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself. We start with verse 1, asking God to hear and answer. Verse 2, the complaint. Verse 3, declaring trust in God. Verses 4 to 5, wisdom offered to those struggling. And then verses 6 to 8, declaring trust in God. Turning to God, the psalmist's main desire is to know that God is listening. Often when we go through difficult times, the most difficult thing is feeling like God is silent in our struggles. It seems like they are being accused of something, and they are upset that their honour has been turned to shame, and that everyone is making up lies about them. But this person chooses to respond to these insults by putting their trust in God. While humans may accuse and lie, God sets those that are His apart and listens to them when they pray. Next, they give themselves a pep talk. In the midst of this struggle, it would be very easy to make some poor decisions and do stuff that they shouldn't. Instead, they shouldn't respond out of anger, but take themselves away and think through everything properly. They should make sure that they are right before God and put their trust in Him. The psalmist is now beginning to pull themselves out of this sense of despair. They could continue, like many others, wondering if anything good will happen and begging God to be kind to them. But the psalmist knows that God's will is already for them and has given them the joy that they need to survive. And so to the end, the psalmist makes the greatest declaration of trust in God. They will sleep peacefully that night, knowing that God is the one who keeps them safe. Just as Psalms 3 is a prayer that was commonly read out in the morning, Psalm 4 was read out in the evening before going to bed each night. These two psalms serve as a reminder of the importance of starting and ending each day with God. It's the greatest way to get through difficult times. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.